Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the Federal Reserve's 2% goal. Now, this is something that you hear a lot about, the 2% target, that the Federal Reserve is attempting to get inflation to a 2% target. This is what they are looking to achieve. This is what they want for their monetary policy. This is what they want for the economy. And everybody is under this expectation that the Federal Reserve is going to stay in a restrictive monetary policy until the 2% inflation target has been achieved. Interesting enough is that the Federal Reserve is not going for a 2% target. Now, this is something that most people, like 99% of the people out there, have no idea about. They hear it within the mainstream media that the Federal Reserve has this 2% inflation target that they are attempting to achieve, as if inflation makes it to 2%, that they are winning their policy or their strategy, or however you want to look at it. It's not accurate. This is not the accurate way of looking at the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Now, even just recently in a speech given by Christopher Waller, who was a member of the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, he had this to say in this speech: the FOMC's inflation goal is an average of 2% over the long run, and there are some good reasons to think that price increases will be modest going forward. Now, this is important to understand because this is the only sentence inside of this entire speech that brings any kind of light to the accuracy of their Federal Reserve's monetary policy strategy. Because everything else is very, how do I say it, like assuming, or even like not necessarily clarifying on what it is that the Federal Reserve is attempting to achieve with their monetary policy in the idea of bringing inflation down to a 2% goal. Now, this 2% target is not what the Federal Reserve is attempting to achieve. And again, he says it right there. The Fed's goal is an average of 2% over the long run, and there are some good reasons to think that the price increases will be modest going forward. Now, this is important to internalize and think about because this is what the long-run goals for monetary policy. This was adopted January 24th of 2012. It was modified in August of 2020, and this was going to be effective until January 30th of 2024. But ultimately, this has not changed. Like, the statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies have not changed since they had now announced it back in August of 2020. Now, this is what it has to say. In order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, this 2%, right, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, very much like what Christopher Waller just said in his speech the other day. And therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. So now we think about this. What are they attempting to do? 2% over time. What will likely to occur? Moderately above 2%. What did Christopher Waller say in his speech? Oops, let me bring it back up here. The FOMC's goal is an average of 2% over the long run, and therefore there are some good reasons to think that price increases will be modest going forward, moderately above 2% over the long run. Now, this is very important to internalize and understand because when you go back to this monetary policy strategies, that has not changed yet. Like, the Federal Reserve hasn't come out with a new statement saying, hey, these are our long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. You know right there that they are going for a 2% average inflation rate over time, with inflation moderately above 2%. Now, if you go and look at the speech that Jerome Powell had given back in August of 2020, hold on, let me bring it up. Right here, this was new economic challenges in the Fed's monetary policy review. And again, this was given August 27th of 2020. Now, in this speech, Jerome Powell goes and reiterates that long-term strategy and monetary policy strategies. It says this. Oops, let me bring it up here. There it is. says, we have also made important changes with regard to price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be an inflation rate of 2%. Our statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of the dual mandate will be most effective if long-term inflation expectations remain at 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time inflation averages less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal. Right? The inflation goal is below it, and pull realized inflation down. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement, this is the Federal Reserve's new statement, indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, very much like what Waller just said in his speech the other day. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time, reiterating just exactly what was being said in the long-term strategies and monetary policy, long-term policy goals and strategies. Okay, anyway. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations. It will not be dictated by any formula. Of course, if excessive inflationary pressures were to build or inflation expectations were to ratchet above levels consistent with our goal, we would not hesitate to act. Now, you think about that for just a second. We had a situation prior to the pandemic in which that in inflation expectations and the inflationary scenario that was occurring within the economy was persistently below 2%. It wasn't being achieved. The Federal Reserve was failing their monetary policy strategy by not having inflation at the 2% target. Now, a lot of times people will just think money printer go burr, prices go up. Inflation comes from the fact that the Federal Reserve was printing money. Well, they had quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4, took the balance sheet from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion and failed to produce the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. And this was a major problem for the Federal Reserve. In fact, if you go back to a speech given by John Williams, he had this to say. This is a speech given November 30th of 2018, Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. And now I'm not going to read this whole speech, but this part that I have read so many times on this channel, but I think it's very important that people internalize and understand that the Federal Reserve was in a bind. They were not going to be able to achieve their monetary policy goals or strategies or anything else because of this reason right here. Today, we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Essentially, what he is saying is that they would much rather have an inflation expectation that is persistently too high rather than too low. And right now, we have an inflationary scenario that is moderately above 2%. Right? I don't know what moderately above 2% is supposed to be, right? 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 3.4. Who knows what moderately above 2%, but the goal coming from the Federal Reserve is moderately above 2% with no mathematical formula to figure it out. Again, when we go back to the strategies, long-run goals and strategies, it says in order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. And therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Right now, what we are experiencing within the inflationary scenario and the economy and the monetary policy and everything else is right in line with what the Federal Reserve was looking for. exactly in line with what they were looking for. And now, as many people are feeling the experience of the pain and misery and suffering from the inflationary scenario that has ripped through the economy over the last few years, the Federal Reserve is cool with it. They wanted this scenario. They wanted it just like this. And now I listen to people complaining all the time about how their wages no longer is enough to buy the food and the apartment and the ways, just their normal bills. They are finding it very difficult to operate out there in the world, and now the Federal Reserve is looking for that to be the case. They were wanting that. They were wanting that inflation expectation to be persistent within the economy because that was the problem they needed to solve, was the risk of inflation that was persistently too low rather than too high. As they achieved this goal, most people are looking at the Federal Reserve saying they're almost there. They're almost achieved their goal. They're getting closer to their goal. And I'm thinking, no, this is it right here. They have achieved it. They are winning their strategy. They are not attempting to win it. They are winning it. And as much as they are winning it, we are feeling the pain from it. And we are hoping and waiting in anticipation and with an expectation that the Federal Reserve is soon going to make it easier. Right? How is that? How is it that they're going to make it easier when they are achieving their goal right now? They are not close to getting to their goal. They are achieving their goal. So everything that we are experiencing within the economy is right in line with what it is that the Federal Reserve was hoping for and looking for. The pain that we feel, the misery that we feel, the separation, the inequality, everything going down to like the housing market, all this other stuff is exactly what the Federal Reserve was hoping to achieve. And so long as we continue to have an elevated inflation expectation going into the future, this is totally working for the Fed. And this is hard to deal with for a lot of people because they live in this idea that the Federal Reserve is soon going to make it easier. This is not going to get any easier. This is it. This is what they were attempting. This is the economy that they were looking for. And so as most people live in desperation for the Federal Reserve to act so that they can have an easier way of life, it's not going to get any easier. Right? If anything else out there, it's going to get harder. Things are going to slow down. There's going to be less transactions taking place. And the reason why there's going to be less transactions taking place is because the Federal Reserve is not really in a condition in which they can even stimulate. Most people don't realize how bad of a situation that the Federal Reserve is truly in when it comes to trying to stimulate the economy because the lowering of the Fed funds rate doesn't work. People will ask me all the time, are the Fed going to cut? And I think, does it really matter? We were discussing this just recently in a live stream where somebody asked me again, is the Federal Reserve going to cut 50 basis points at the next meeting? And I think to myself, if you knew ahead of time, like you knew 3 months ago, 4 months ago, that the Federal Reserve was going to be doing a jumbo rate cut, and you had that information, like nobody else knew it, just you, and you knew for sure that the Federal Reserve was going to cut rates by 50 basis points, and you had that information 4 months ahead of time, and you were in the idea of possibly buying a house, would you have made the decision to go ahead and sign the deal on that mortgage to buy that house, absolutely knowing that the Federal Reserve was going to be going into a 50 basis point jumbo rate cut going into the future? Not knowing what was going to happen, just knowing for sure that the Federal Reserve was going to make that move. And you made that purchase and you decided back then, 4 months ago, whether or not to make that purchase. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, I got a Federal Reserve information knowing that they are going to cut rates by 50 basis points in 4 months. Do I make the purchase of the house today, or do I wait for the Federal Reserve to cut rates? Because if you made that purchase knowing that the Federal Reserve was going to cut rates going into the future, it would have been the right move, considering that after the Fed cut rates, mortgage rates went up. See, people think, okay, what is the Federal Reserve going to do? Even if you had the information, would you have held on to the idea that you were going to wait till the Fed cut rates so that you could get a cheaper mortgage, only to find out that you had waited and mortgage rates went up and now you cannot get that cheaper mortgage? Now, granted, it isn't that much, right? It was what? 6% a few months ago, and it's at like 7% now. I didn't check it today, but it had moved up since the Federal Reserve had cut rates. However, if you had that information ahead of time that the Fed was going to be cutting rates, and you knew that they were going to cut rates, and you held back on the idea of purchasing that house because you knew that the Fed was going to cut rates and it ended up being the wrong decision, what would you do with the information today if you knew for a fact that the Federal Reserve was going to be cutting rates again going into the future at the next meeting? See, even if you knew today, man, I know for sure the Fed is going to cut rates again, 50 basis points going at the next meeting. How would you deal with that information? Considering that if you had purchased the house prior to the Fed rate cut, you would have gotten a better mortgage than if you had waited for them to cut rates. See, this is how many people are losing it when it comes to understanding how it is that this economy is operating, because they listen to so many different people out there, so many different economists who are telling them so many different things about what it is that the Federal Reserve is doing, about how the inflationary scenario is working out, how they're failing at their monetary policy. All this stuff is being stated out there, and people try to internalize what it is that they need to do as far as this information goes. And I'm telling you right now, you are being bombarded with propaganda. All right? It's all propaganda. If you go back and you listen to what it is that the Federal Reserve was stating for their monetary policy way back prior to the pandemic, I mean, they're talking about this stuff way back in early 2000. I mean, even before that, I bring up speeches given by Ben Bernanke talking about how the economy was going, or how the Federal Reserve and the monetary policy was going to hit the lower bound of zero, meaning that the Fed funds rate gets to zero, and they would still not be able to stimulate the economy. That they would have to come up with other ways of dealing with the economy, knowing that the Fed fund rate adjustment wasn't going to do it anymore. And so once you recognize that that was a possibility going into the future, and how it is that the Federal Reserve had set up all the different communication channels in order to deliver information to the market so they could then get the markets to act ahead of time, to act in a way that is then in line with what it is that the Federal Reserve is attempting to achieve. See, like, most people don't see it that way. They look at what the Federal Reserve is doing and not what they are saying. And what they are saying and how people receive that information is so important. And you can see now how it is that the Federal Reserve comes out with all this different, like, Fed governors and all this different communications, and very confusing. People are like, man, is it going up or down or sideways? What's going on? That is part of their goal. That is part of how it is that they communicate in order to have a better monetary policy. This is, again, stated directly from the Federal Reserve. And I believe it was Jefferson who had given this speech. Oops. Let me see if I can bring it up. Talking about this exact thing. Come on. Oops, that's the discount. What is it? Let me see if I can find it here real quick for you guys. Oh, nope, that's the discount window. Oh, I can't bring it up now. I don't have it on my list here. Well, that's too bad. But ultimately, the Federal Reserve had set up different communication channels in order to achieve their delivery of the information. See, they set up all these different ways of being able to inject information into the economy to people who normally wouldn't listen, to people who would typically not take in information when it comes to the economy. And so ultimately they had to go and find how it is that they could get this information to these different parts of the economy so everybody would be on the same page when it came to the inflationary scenario. And this is not something that is was typical of the Fed. Like, the Fed used to be a very quiet communication. Like, they would not let people know exactly what it was that they were up to, and then one day you would just wake up and the Fed funds rate had moved. Nowadays, they deliver all kinds of forward guidance, signaling, jawboning in order to guide the market into the appropriate monetary policy. Most people not knowing that the Fed funds rate isn't it, but the belief of what the Fed funds rate is going to do has so much more impact on the economy. Too bad I couldn't find that thing. Where is that? Oh, well. Alrighty, guys, I'm just going to leave it at that since I can't find my folders anymore in here. And now I think that was probably long enough. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.